Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Between the Headlines. I'm Kasper Korsgaard, and tonight on the panel is Mr. Guy Healy, a journalist formerly working with The Australian and as a stringer for the BBC, and Professor David Peets with the Griffith Business School. Today's topic is the budget, being presented last night by the coalition government. But we start off with another economic news from yesterday, where the Reserve Bank of Australia announced a decrease in the interest rate to 1.75%. This is due to the state of the economy, which is not as it should be, says the bank, the Reserve Bank, sorry. Now, this budget being presented in this time, how does that feed into this state of the economy and the message that the Reserve Bank is giving of a struggling economy, David?
Well, the Reserve Bank's saying the economy's not going so well. The government's saying this is a budget for jobs and growth. And, the Reserve Bank is kind of undermining that message even before it's delivered. And indeed, when you look at the growth itself, the growth that's forecast in the budget is pretty unimpressive. 2.5% over the coming year and then 3% over the years after that. There's nothing impressive about that at all. And indeed, the 2.5% growth is lower than what were the previous projections in the mid-year forecast or in the previous year's budget for what would be happening over the coming year. So the idea of jobs and growth is more about the rhetoric and trying to frame the budget than it is about what the budget is actually doing. Every politician will tell you their budget is about jobs and growth. And particularly if they haven't got much else to say about it, that's what they'll focus on. And I think that's really what's going on with the growth rhetoric. It's not so much that there really is strong growth there. The Reserve Bank says there's not, and budget figures themselves don't imply there is. It's more that, look over there. There's growth.
Yeah. And Guy, the Treasurer says that these are difficult times, and presenting a budget, how do you think the government has handled these difficult times?
I'd just like to pick up on answering you and just picking up on what David said. Totally agree with all of that, especially about the jobs and growth mantra. We are now at the 2.5-year mark of the coalition government, and we are getting a national plan. Now, what does that say about the previous two budgets and for the past 2.5 years? As a voter, I would have thought I'm disappointed that we have to wait till now to get what's described as a plan. So I would have thought these are serious matters. If governments expect voters to take them seriously, I would expect that they would be able to hit the ground running upon election and start unfurling their plans and performing well, so that to improve societies and people's well-being. So I'm frankly, fairly disappointed by it.
And one of the specific measures in the budget is the PATH scheme, a way to get young unemployed people back into work through Prepare, Train and Hire is the scheme. It's a $752 million scheme, including 6 weeks of training for young unemployed, 4 to 12 weeks of internships, and then subsidies for businesses to take on young employers. Now, critics say that this is just a way of just giving small businesses money to take on young people. Will it actually work? And why do you think they're doing it, David? Why do you reckon that the coalition government is taking this step, and will it work, you think?
Well, they've done it partly because the Work for the Dole scheme has been a bit of a failure, and the evaluations have basically shown that. And so they had to do something, but they don't particularly want to get rid of it because there's some rhetorical shtick in having a Work for the Dole scheme that they quite like. But they've switched that from saying you have to go on to work for the dole after 6 months unemployment to 12 months unemployment, created some savings there and used some of that money to fund this scheme. And, it's more worthwhile for the participants than Work for the Dole, but that's not saying a great deal. And it's just the key element of it, that the T in it, which is basically about internships. Mm-hmm. And that internships is a term that a lot of people in this university will be familiar with, because a lot of our students, they want to have an internship in an organisation as part of their studies. And what that means is you go to an organisation, you learn new skills, you learn about the organisation, you learn how that sort of place works, and you pick up something that will help you get a job. You learn stuff. But the internships that they're describing in this don't really seem to have any relationship to what we're used to at universities. They're more about finding a cheap source of labour for a defined period. So that there's two examples really given in the documentation. And one is basically about working in a supermarket, stacking shelves, and the other's going to work as a waiter in a cafe.
And those really the kind of job that you want to help along, or should it be more innovative jobs?
Well, there's certainly nothing innovative about that.
No.
But I guess where it sort of fits into a broader industrial agenda, really, rather than an employment agenda, it's more an industrial agenda in that these are the specific industries they're mentioning are industries where there's a lot of night work and Sunday work done. There's been big cases in the Fair Work Commission and big political debates about penalty rates being paid in those industries. Now, if you can get somebody and pay them $4 or $5 an hour and you get a payment of $1,000 from the government, to have this person doing work that somebody else who you would otherwise be hiring might be doing, well, it's a good deal for the employer, but it's not necessarily going to do to create employment. And
Right.
so probably the main effect would be displacing people who otherwise would have been hired to do this work, in expanding supermarkets or cafes, whatever, instead of taking on a new employee.
Right.
Take on one of these so-called internships.
So it is as much a help as to businesses as it is to unemployed people. Now, Guy, how does that sell as a political message?
I think the atmospherics of doing internships is, if they sell it well, then it's a big if, will go down very well. And I totally endorse any effective means of helping lower about the 20% or 17 to 20% youth unemployment rate, and that varies at various parts of around the country. But I'm actually really concerned by what David has just said in terms of, I'm really sorry, in terms of being worried by what you said, in terms of the precarity of work for young people and even older people, in terms of the lack of a lot of the work seems to be, there's this increasing casualization of work and also fewer full-time permanent jobs, and this sort of seems to be like a hollowing out of the economy. And I would be concerned if this scheme does anything to further exacerbate that already very worrying trend. I mean, how are people meant to achieve the great Australian dream of having a decent job and a decent career and a decent house and family if they don't have a permanent job and a way to fund it?
Big questions, yeah. Another big issue in the budget is, of course, taxes. It's been spoken a lot about. It is an important issue, and they're doing a lot of things. Now, one of the things they're doing is the income tax. They are raising the middle tax bracket from $80,000 a year to $87,000 a year. Now, this is a fairly good income if you're making $80,000 a year. Guy, why do you think this is the demographic they're targeting with the very small, and they're saying this themselves, tax cut that is in the budget?
I assume that they would be, just from a crude political analysis of mine, I assume they would be targeting their political base. But I understand it's mainly to address an issue with tax creep, which I know very little about. The only thing that does concern me there is I understand that there'll be no tax cuts for anyone under $80,000. And that would be the vast bulk of the of workers and people in the economy, I would have thought. So I think they may well be vulnerable on the fairness. We haven't seen this yet. It's still very early days. It's only the first 24 hours, and this has got a long campaign to run. We've got 2 months, almost two months. So I think the government might be vulnerable on this unfairness angle from that point of view. But But that's just rolling commentary. I'll
And
be what David has to say.
Yeah, and bracket creep is something that affects low-income workers as well, and middle-income workers. It doesn't just affect those on incomes over 80,000 a year, but they don't receive anything from this. And indeed, some of the lowest-paid people who are moving on to benefits or pensions and so on, they're actually going to be facing a drop in income because of what's referred to as the withdrawal of compensation for the carbon tax. But all income groups receive compensation for the carbon tax. It's been withdrawn from really the lowest income group. The upper middle income group is getting the benefits of raising of the tax threshold to account for bracket creep, which is basically when prices and wages rise, then you move into a higher tax bracket, or a higher proportion of your income is in that higher tax bracket. And so the upper middle income, 80 to 87,000 above, really, get that small benefit. And then a bigger benefit goes to the people on 180,000 a year, where the deficit reduction levy, which is a 2% additional income tax for them, is being withdrawn, even though the deficit is substantially higher than it was when it was introduced. So there's some quite uneven distributional effects that at the top end of the income scale, there's some quite significant reductions in income tax, and down at the bottom there's either nothing or eventually there's going to be a cut in your payments.
Can you try and just explain to us how big a cut is this? How much, and will it actually do anything? The headline of the budget is jobs and growth. Is this measure raising the middle tax bracket something that will create jobs and growth?
No. I mean, I think the whole idea that cutting taxes is going to have a major impact on jobs, there's not really much credible evidence in support of that. And Australia actually has one of the lowest ratios of tax to GDP amongst the OECD countries, certainly the bottom end. And there's many countries that have historically, for decades and decades, have had much higher rates of taxation, have still performed quite strongly. The countries in Norway, which has probably the highest productivity in the world, and Sweden, and a number of these countries have much higher tax. And on the long run, you don't really see a relationship between tax and the level of employment. And that also goes for company tax too, because you've seen, one of the main features of this budget is the reduction in company tax, which in the short term is just applied to small businesses, but gradually the definition of small businesses gets bigger and bigger, and then eventually every business, no matter how large, gets a tax cut down to 25 cents in the dollar instead of 30 cents in the dollar.
That's actually the next point I want to talk to you about, because what they're also doing is they're touching on corporate taxes, targeting small and medium-sized businesses. One thing they're doing is cutting the tax rate from 28.5 to 27.5, and then ultimately in 10 years 25% flat they want it to be, and also increasing what is called the turnover threshold, so that what you see as a small business is today a business with a revenue of $2 million a year. That will be raised to $10 million a year, and then ultimately also $25 million a year. A lot of numbers. Now, what will the impact, do you think, be of these measures combined, David?
Well, cutting company tax is probably even less efficient than cutting income tax in terms of creating jobs. Like Canada cut income tax cut company tax quite substantially a few years ago under the Harper government, and the impact it had was 2/3 of not much at all. And if you listen to Scott Morrison yesterday, I definitely remember he started off one of his talks with how we're going much better than Canada. Well, our company tax is so much better than Canada. So cutting company tax hasn't been the solution for Canada. All it's done is basically create a revenue hole. Now, unfortunately, with this 10-year plan, we don't know what the impact on revenue is going to be, because they only give estimates for the first 4 years, and you can't really extrapolate from them to 10 years because the cost of the cuts gets bigger and bigger, as they apply to as they become larger and they apply to more business. It'd be something between 20 and 30 billion dollars, I expect, would be the cumulative cost. But I really don't know, and it could even be more than that. It's hard to say without giving numbers, and that's going to create some fairly big long-term problems. So you sort of look at this budget in the longer term. Terms like plan and so on, they imply you've got a long-term vision, and the long term is going to be this shortfall in company tax revenue with little or no benefit. The Treasury's own estimates is going to have a tiny impact on employment, and even that's controversial because of, like I said, the Canadian experience.
Sure.
And it's really a continuation of what we saw in 2014 when the coalition government came into office, and there were a number of major cuts in a number of areas that went contrary to what had been said before the election. And some of those cuts have been blocked in the Senate and abandoned. Some of them have been blocked in the Senate and they're still there. So, for example, in higher education, there's 20% cuts in higher education funding for universities.
Student per place.
That's right. And it hasn't, the budget contains no detail of how that's going to be implemented now. It's just sort of it's sort of put off for a year. The numbers are there in the budget saying we're going to get this saving, but not saying how. And this really goes back to 2040. There are some other cuts like massive reductions in allocations for primary and secondary school education and for health. Now this budget makes announcements about increases in spending for these, but they're nowhere near the amount that was reduced 2 years ago. So you do have to think of this as, in a sense, it is a plan. It's part of a long-term plan. You've got to go back a few years. You've got to look ahead several years to see where this budget really fits.
It is being presented as a 10-year plan, but guys, sticking with the corporate tax cuts, it is pretty agreed upon that we need better growth rates. I mean, even though we're actually doing pretty good in a Western OECD comparison, aiming at 3% following years, still pretty good. But the key to growth is small and medium businesses, pretty well established. What other measures could have been taken other than looking at the taxation, you reckon?
Okay. Well, I endorse and commend the government for the multinational tax evasion crackdown and the tax task force. I think these are. I think all Australians would want companies to pay their fair share of tax. They don't want to be left feeling like mugs if they're paying their fair share of tax and companies aren't. And if the government doesn't, and I noticed that I think the government is hoping to get something like $3.3 billion out of this measure. Yes. I will be impressed and surprised if they do get that, but I very much hope they do, because these measures are necessary to give governments the sorts of flexibility so that they can apply where social problems arise, and we have got a lot of social problems. They can be applied to help solve these problems that we have as a society.
But
in terms of growth, I would have liked to have seen two things. One, I would have liked to have seen, perhaps this might be outside the budget cycle, but increased environmental regulation, because we know that from the literature that is associated with better innovation and national competitiveness. It sounds counterintuitive, but that's very serious scientific literature on that. And the other thing I would really like to have seen is a commitment to renewables and to trying to tap into what is being described as the new renewables boom. Now, China and the US in relatively recent times have signed a huge deal on renewables. Germany is really smart. They are doing all of this really high-end manufacturing, selling their equipment into China to help them commercialize the renewables boom. Now, I'm just really concerned that Australia, we've lost our car manufacturing, and we are missing this boat. We've got incredibly smart people in the universities like UNSW with the solar panels, etc. And there's a great potential here to tap into that high-end innovation. Now, I must commend the government for the National Innovation and Science Agenda, which was announced in December, $1.1 billion. that looks as though it's steady. So I mean that's a big tick there. And I almost must commend, and I'm also very pleased to see the apparent dumping of the anti-university rhetoric from the government that was prevalent under the Abbott era. So they are now looking, this government, the Turnbull government, looks as though it's looking to universities to help foster this innovation. It's something that's very, very welcome. The champagne corks are probably not popping. There might be, as they've said, I think I read this morning, it's probably more like you have a beer and you start to sip it with some relief sort of a situation. And of course, and there's a big, so that's very welcome. But there's a caveat on that, and we just don't know. This is a frighten, as some of the other commentary this morning was. This is a note. Don't frighten the horses before the election budget. Very important to keep that in mind. So, and then we know that next May there's that first return budget of a new government can be a shocker. So we just have to wait and see. So how much of this will be unpacked, and how much the voters will pay attention to this stuff now over the next couple of months remains to be seen. There is some potential for that the electorate does wake up during pre-election periods. Mm-hmm. So, but we'll just have to see how it plays out.
Yeah, and it is, Malcolm Turnbull said himself this morning that there will be a July 2nd election. It hasn't been called yet. This budget obviously playing into the election campaign. Now, David, how do you think that this stands as a pre-election budget?
Well, I don't think the budget itself will make a huge difference, because it's really just putting into one place a whole lot of things that we already knew or either had happened or were going to happen, and it's really part of that long-term agenda. And so the main issues in the election are going to be the sorts of issues that people were talking about before the budget. They'll be talking about them after the budget, and what you've seen in here, it basically hasn't made a huge deal of difference to that. If the government was hoping that it was going to rescue them, well, I don't really think they seriously could have, because it would have been impossible to put together a budget that could rescue them in these circumstances. So the priorities that it gives to certain groups, and away from other groups and away from other activities, who benefits from tax changes, who's disadvantaged by them, who benefits from what you're not doing in areas like negative gearing or capital gains tax. They're going to be the core issues. And people might use the rhetoric of, the budget did this, the budget did that, but it's really the underlying ideas and the underlying policies that are going to feed into the election result.
Mm-hmm. I'm coming towards the end here, Guy. Any closing statements on how it's going to feed into the election?
Oh, well, that's an imponderable. There's no big election sweeteners, and the voters usually expect those just be prior to elections. This will be fought in. I think there's something like Labor only needs a 4%, something like a 4% swing, uniform swing to win government. Of course, so all of the focus will be on the marginal electorates, the swinging seats, mm-hmm. And I'm not sure. From what I understand, Labor, so the Libs haven't got a very well bedded down election campaign team, and so I think they might be a little vulnerable in that area. But I'm not an expert on calling elections. I think from what some of the smart money I've heard is it could be a hung parliament. So it's tight. It could be tight.
We will keep an eye on that. Thank you very much for joining us. That's all we have time for this week. Join us next week, and please feel free to leave your comments in the section below. Thank you.